A man sits alone in his car outside the office parking lot. The engine is off. His coffee has gone cold. Inside the building, people are already beginning another ordinary Tuesday. Meetings will start. Emails will arrive. Someone will joke about the weekend. Everything will look exactly the way it did yesterday. Yet he can't make himself open the door. It isn't because he hates his job. It isn't because he has failed. If anything, his life looks respectable. A stable income. A family that loves him. Friends who describe him as reliable. From the outside, there is no obvious reason to feel lost. And that is precisely what makes the feeling so difficult to explain. Because how do you admit that your life looks successful, while quietly wondering if you've somehow missed your own? That question follows far more men than anyone realizes. It doesn't arrive all at once. It appears in ordinary moments. Driving home in silence after everyone else has gone to sleep. Watching old classmates celebrate another milestone. Realizing you've spent an entire year staying busy without feeling any closer to yourself. Eventually, another question begins to surface. One that most men immediately push away. What if I'm not behind, but living someone else's definition of ahead? He doesn't answer it. Not yet. Because answering that question would require questioning almost everything that brought him here. So instead, he starts working harder. He assumes the discomfort is temporary. Another promotion. A larger paycheck. A better house. Surely one more achievement will finally make everything feel real. For a while, that strategy works. Or at least it looks like it does. People congratulate him. His parents feel proud. His children see a dependable father. His coworkers admire his discipline. The strange thing about external validation is that it can become loud enough to drown out your own voice. Not forever. Just long enough. Long enough to wake up one morning and realize you've become exceptionally skilled at maintaining a life you've never stopped questioning. Most people believe identity is something we discover. In reality, much of it is inherited. Long before a boy understands himself, he begins collecting quiet instructions. Be useful. Be strong. Don't complain. Stay productive. Always know what you're doing. No one has to say these words directly. He learns them simply by watching. Watching which men receive respect. Watching which emotions make people uncomfortable. Watching which dreams are considered practical and which are quietly abandoned. Years later, those borrowed expectations no longer feel borrowed. They feel like truth. And that's where the real confusion begins. Because every decision starts answering a question he never consciously chose. What kind of man will people accept? Not, what kind of man am I becoming? The difference between those two questions is almost invisible. Until one day, it becomes impossible to ignore. Notice something. The men who constantly worry about falling behind rarely stop moving. They're exhausted, busy, responsible, always solving the next problem, always preparing for the next milestone. Yet very little of that movement feels like progress. Why? Because movement and alignment are not the same thing. A compass can point in the wrong direction with perfect consistency. And the faster you walk, the longer it takes to realize you were never headed where your heart wanted to go. That realization doesn't feel inspiring. It feels terrifying. Because if the direction was wrong, then what exactly have all these years been building? Most people think this is the moment where confidence disappears. It's actually the moment honesty quietly enters the room. Psychologists often describe adulthood as a period of identity formation. But that description misses something important. For many men, adulthood is less about discovering who they are, and more about slowly recognizing who they have been pretending to be. The performance is rarely intentional. It begins with love, with wanting approval, with wanting security, with wanting to become someone others can depend on. None of those desires are wrong. The problem begins when the role survives longer than the person who created it. Imagine a man who dreamed of becoming a photographer when he was 20. Life happened. Bills replaced possibilities. Marriage brought responsibility. Children brought purpose. So he accepted a career that made sense. 20 years later, someone casually asks what he enjoys doing. He answers with silence. Not because he has no hobbies, because he honestly doesn't remember. That silence says more than words ever could. It isn't the silence of failure. It's the silence of a forgotten self. And forgotten parts of us have a peculiar habit. They never disappear. They simply wait, sometimes for decades, waiting for a quiet Tuesday morning, a conversation with an old friend, a child's unexpected question, or a single moment alone in a parked car, to ask the question that has been patiently waiting beneath every achievement. If becoming successful required leaving myself behind, who exactly succeeded? He doesn't answer that question immediately. Very few men do. Because once the question exists, something inside them begins to shift. The promotion no longer feels exactly the same. The expensive watch tells a different story. Even praise becomes strangely complicated. Not because those things have lost their value, but because they can no longer hide the question beneath them. This is why some of the biggest turning points in a man's life don't begin with a breakthrough. They begin with disappointment. A business fails. A marriage changes. A parent passes away. A company decides his loyalty is no longer needed. From the outside, these moments look like life, taking something away. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. For the first time in years, the role breaks. And when the role breaks, the man finally has a chance to meet himself. Carl Jung once suggested that much of our lives is spent becoming the person we were expected to be before we begin becoming the person we actually are. Perhaps that's why so many men who appear late are quietly doing invisible work no one can measure. While others are collecting achievements, they're shedding identities. And that process is rarely impressive. It looks like uncertainty, like changing careers in your 40s, like starting over when everyone assumes you should already have the answers, like admitting, for the first time, that you've been successful at living a life that never felt completely yours. Most people call this a crisis, but what if it isn't? What if it's the first honest conversation you've ever had with yourself? Don't answer too quickly. Watch what happens the next time life interrupts your plans. Before asking, "Why is this happening to me?" notice whether another question quietly appears. What is this interruption refusing to let me ignore? Sometimes life doesn't destroy your direction. It removes the distractions that kept you from seeing it. That is why men who succeed later often carry a different kind of confidence. It isn't louder. It isn't more charismatic. It doesn't need to convince anyone. Because it wasn't built from applause. It was built from surviving the moment when applause stopped being enough. Think about the people whose presence immediately puts you at ease. They're rarely the ones trying hardest to appear important. Their calm comes from somewhere deeper. They've lost enough to know that identity cannot safely rest on titles. They've failed enough to stop confusing mistakes with worth. They've waited long enough to understand that time isn't always stealing from you. Sometimes, it's introducing you to someone you were too busy to become. That's why they no longer chase every opportunity. They choose. They no longer confuse urgency with importance. They protect their attention because they finally understand that attention is where a life is quietly built. And perhaps that's the difference no one notices. When they were younger, they were trying to prove they deserved a meaningful life. Later, they simply started living one. Ironically, that's often when visible success finally arrived. Not because they became more ambitious, but because their energy was no longer divided between building a life and performing one. So maybe the psychology of men who succeed late in life has almost nothing to do with success. Maybe late was never the problem. Maybe the real delay was becoming the person capable of carrying a life that actually belonged to him. The world celebrates the promotion, the business, the recognition, but those are only the visible chapters. The real story happened much earlier. It happened on ordinary mornings when no one was watching, when he chose honesty over appearance, meaning over momentum, alignment over approval. No headlines were written for those moments. Yet every meaningful achievement that followed quietly began there. Perhaps that is why some men seem to bloom later than everyone else. Not because life forgot them, but because some roots grow in darkness before anyone ever sees the tree. And maybe that parked car at the beginning of this story was never about hesitation. Maybe it was the first place where a man stopped asking, "How do I catch up with everyone else?" and finally asked, "Whose life have I been trying to catch?" The answer was never waiting at the finish line. It was waiting beneath every role he had outgrown. That is the hidden psychology of men who succeed late in life. They don't win because they outrun time. They succeed because they eventually stop running from themselves. If the story felt less like information and more like recognition, stay for the next one. There are parts of ourselves we spend years overlooking, until one quiet moment changes the way we see our entire lives.